Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson makes an unannounced visit to Kiev and meets with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky even as the country marked Unity Day. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Germany will coordinate with Western allies on Ukraine weapons cessions. Plus, Russian officials warn that delivery of offensive weapons to Ukraine will lead to a global catastrophe. Welcome to the program this week. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kyiv on a surprise trip over the weekend, meeting Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as the country marked Ukrainian Unity Day. During his trip to Ukraine, Boris Johnson visited Borodyanka, the suburb of the Ukrainian capital that became a byword for atrocities in the West when Russian forces drove towards Kyiv in the first phase of the invasion before being repelled. Boris Johnson was personally welcomed by Zelensky and a row of top officials, including the foreign minister and the head of the president's office, who lined up in a yard near the presidential administration in the heart of the city.
It's an absolute honor to be here.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson also made an unannounced visit to Ukraine's Bucha, the north of Kyiv, promising the UK's support for the long term. He visited a church and placed flowers at a memorial for people killed during Russia's occupation. The former British leader was seen with the regional governor and shook hands with local residents after entering the church that held an exhibition showing the days immediately after Ukraine recaptured the town. French President Emmanuel Macron says he does not rule out the possibility of sending Leclerc tanks to Ukraine, speaking at a summit with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Now, Macron told the news conference that sending tanks must not escalate the situation, must take into account the time to train Ukrainians to be effective, and must not endanger France's own security. Germany and France vowed to assist Ukraine for as long as needed and to support efforts to prosecute war criminals.
La nation restera totale à aider les Ukrainiennes et les Ukrainiens dans leur combat. Et quand il faudra nous avons aussi la volonté.
Our determination stays absolute to help the Ukrainians in their fight. And if Ukraine needs to be reconstructed, we, Europe, will be here. Regarding the Leclerc tanks, I asked the Army Minister, Minister Sébastien Lecornu, to work on it. But nothing has been ruled out. It has to be accessed collectively with three criteria. Firstly, as we had been able to do since the beginning, that it does not escalate the crisis. And we always follow this line. Secondly, that it could bring real and effective support to our Ukrainian friends. And for this, we must consider the capacity to maintain them in operational conditions and training.
Et sur cette base-là, on a répondu avec les bonnes réponses en termes d'infrastructure. On a dit on a besoin.
President of France Emmanuel Macron. On the other hand, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who is under pressure to allow the shipment of German-made tanks to Ukraine, says all decisions on weapons deliveries will be made in coordination with allies, including the United States. Last week, Germany and Western allies reached no decision on whether Germany will agree to send Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine or permit other countries that have them to do so, despite Ukraine's pleas for modern tanks to boost its defense efforts. Speaking at a news conference in Paris about providing tanks to Ukraine, Scholz added that all weapons deliveries to Ukraine so far had taken place in close coordination with Western partners.
USA tun sehr viel, Deutschland tut auch sehr viel.
The US is doing a lot. Germany is also doing a lot. We have constantly expanded our supplies with very effective weapons that are already available today. And we have always closely coordinated all these decisions with all our important allies and friends, with France, for example, with the US, for example, with other major countries in Europe, and of course, with all those who participate in the discussion. The way we have proceeded in the past, always discussing the concrete situation closely with all our friends and allies, is the way we will proceed in the future. We have to fear that this war will continue for a very long time. And that is why it is important for Ukraine to know what we will not slacken our support and will continue to act as long as necessary. But that is also why this principle, which has carried us so well through the last period, remains important for the future. We only act in close coordination with each other.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Meanwhile, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says Germany will not stop Poland from sending Leopard 2 combat tanks to Ukraine if asked. Speaking in an interview on the sides of the French-German cabinet meeting, Baerbock says, quote, "The question has not been asked. If we were asked the question, we would not stand in the way." According to Germany's basic law, weapons intended for warfare may be manufactured, transported, and marketed only with the authorization of the federal government. Under the War Weapons Control Act, the German government must consent to any delivery of German-made weapons to a war zone. Now let's hear from Moscow, where a Russian politician has warned that the continued delivery of weapons to Ukraine will lead to a global catastrophe. The chairman of the State Duma, Russia's lower house of parliament, says delivery of offensive weapons to the Kyiv region will lead to a global catastrophe. Volodin says the delivery of the weapons will lead to Russian retaliation using more powerful weapons. Volodin comments came after NATO partners met at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany to discuss more military aid for Ukraine. He calls on European parliaments to realize their responsibility to humanity. He added that the decisions Brussels and Washington make are leading the world to a terrible war. Also in Russia, Moscow's forces are pushing towards two towns in Ukraine's southern Zaporizhzhia region where fighting intensified this week after several months of a stagnant front. Vladimir Rokov, a Russian-installed official in the region, says offensive actions were concentrated around two towns, around Orikhiv, that's 50 kilometers south of Ukrainian-controlled regional capital Zaporizhzhia, and Holyapol, which is further east. According to Russian state media, Rokov says there was no active fighting in those areas. However, the Russian army claimed it would have taken more advantageous lines and positions after offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia region. Ukraine carried out strikes on facilities in the Donetsk region against Russian soldiers, that's according to the country's National Guard, releasing drone footage of the attack. The footage shows people who were said by Ukraine's National Guard to be Russian soldiers walking towards the building, strikes being carried out, and people running for shelter. Ukraine's National Guard wrote in a social media post, quote, "The work of artillery in coordination with intelligence using UAVs writes news stories when enemy personnel themselves lead to their barracks, ammunition, and hiding places." However, the claim could not be independently verified. Now let's talk to Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, International Affairs Analyst. He joins us virtually from East Midlands in the UK. You're welcome to the program this morning.
Good morning.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you introduce weapons as voracious and deadly as tanks in infantry warfare, it's the deadliest. And when you introduce them into a conflict such as this, isn't that why Russia is saying it's an offensive weapon rather than a defensive one? We saw the roles the tanks played in World War II and how deadly they are when it comes to terrestrial warfare. Do you think that there's any dilly-dallying on the part of the allies of Ukraine because they know this, but they don't want to say it?
Well, it's what it is, and you rightly pointed it out. It's a dilly-dally. Everyone has attacked the German representative for failing to deploy the Leopard tanks, okay? And so the question to ask Russia is this: is Russia tanked or we are talking of tanks. And I think that Russia is getting tanked by the deployment of these tanks. It's a matter of when. It's not even a matter of how. It's a matter of when it will have to get to that point. If you look at it, everybody on the international community is looking at Ukraine saying Ukraine is not fighting back. Instead, Ukraine is on the defensive. That's been the first phase of the war, okay? Let us try to do a chronicle of the issues. First off, Ukraine decides, I want to join NATO, I want to boost my defense on that part of the world, okay? And then Russia says, no, you can't do that. You invite NATO, we are not in allies with NATO countries and all of that. You bring chaos to the region. And so Russia started to annex the regions around itself, around Ukraine, and then Ukraine called to NATO for help. And NATO says, we are not going to attack Russia, but we are going to help you defend your territory. And Ukraine has been under constant bombardment for at least 10 months. It's running into a year. In a few weeks, it's a year. So Ukraine has been defending itself. Now it gets to the point where Ukraine has to push back. And the last phase of the fight, Ukraine indeed started to push back. So that is, Ukraine started to attack the areas where Russia has occupied of its own territory to be able to push Russia back. So the gloves had been off before now. As of today, what Ukraine is saying is the next method to escalate the defense of our territory would be to deploy these tanks, of course, to try to push Russia back. If not, it will become overwhelmed and the defense may totally collapse. So they need these tanks. Russia is tanked, and it's just a question of when these tanks will be deployed. Germany was foot dragging, and Germany has invented these tanks, which is a lesson for the rest of the world yet again. Germany invented these tanks. Germany has been suffering from the cut in power and in gas from Russia to it. It doesn't want to be seen as the one making the decision at this point for fear of retaliation from Russia to further escalate the economic crisis that Germany is going through. So Germany is saying, there are countries of the world, especially in Europe, that have our tanks. United States is one of those countries. Poland is another of those countries. So if these countries make up their minds to deploy tanks to Ukraine without us leading it, even though they need our consent as manufacturers, so be it. Would the tanks be deployed? Yes. Would Germany lead it? Absolutely no. There are at least 3 countries that will lead the deployment of these tanks. They are France, United States, and United Kingdom. And you can see Boris Johnson, who is a big man on the international space, not just by his body stature, but by the bold decisions he makes, okay? So he's going there to try to start setting the stage for the deployment of these tanks. I like the idea that the French president has highlighted at least 3 guidelines for the deployment of these tanks. And that is that Ukraine soldiers will be trained on the use of the tanks, not only for their safety, but training Ukrainian soldiers to be able to use these tanks means deployment of more foreign troops. Because those who train will not train and lead, they will train and help in the deployment of the tanks. Something that Russia doesn't want to hear, which means that it's not only the tanks that are arriving. They are arriving with their competence. They are also arriving with more troops from the rest of Europe. The dilly-dally will go on for a few more days, but those tanks will definitely be deployed, and you can be rest assured Russia is tanked yet again.
When you take into account that those tanks require a whole lot of technical training, as you correctly pointed out, and that will mean more personnel coming from the allies of Ukraine, and that Russia has been given more than fair warning, do you think, therefore, that mediation should come into play as far as the deployment of the tanks is concerned?
Well, yes, we've been asking for mediation, and mediation has taken at least 4 phases. When the invasion started, the Ukrainian representatives sat down with the Russian representatives 2 or 3 times. It failed. Then the rest of the world rose up with Ukraine, and then Russia was thinking at some point we may have to discuss. Again, he thought he had some victories here and there, gaining some regions, and then refused to come to the table. Before December, we were waiting again for some kind of mediatory talks between Russia and Ukraine. That was passed over. Now we are in winter. And of course, Russia was thinking by winter we will be able to record some victories. But the tanks, the deployment of the tanks changes the story altogether. Would there be talks? The talks won't come before the tanks are deployed. The talks will come, but they won't come before the tanks are deployed. Zelensky said to us last week, at the beginning, just about a week ago, he's not sure even the Russian president is still alive. The Russian president is rumored is undergoing health crisis. So it's not even certain that there's any real representative from Russia to sit at these talks. But you don't talk with your enemy without being fortified. So the first thing is you fortify Ukraine with these tanks, and then Russia will be forced to consider either coming to the table to talk, or it will escalate the fight by deployment of even more warfare. There's a last phase of artillery that Russia would like to deploy, which is the satanic nuclear bombs. Will they be forced to do it? Will they crystallize another war? I don't think so. But at some point, after the deployment of the tanks, we'll have to sit at the table to have talks yet again.
Let's talk for a bit, if we can, about the visit of Boris Johnson to the Ukraine. He's been made an honorary citizen by Zelensky. We know the position that the UK have taken, which is more hardline when you compare that to France and to Turkey and to Israel, who can still come to the negotiating table. But what good do you think comes from the Boris Johnson visit?
I'll tell you the truth, the win situation here is, I see only two. Number one, it's for Boris Johnson himself. He remains a global leader, even though he's no longer Prime Minister of Britain. But of course, a comeback is on the cards. On the international scene, Boris Johnson is well respected. Amongst his own people, maybe not really. So Rishi Sunak at home has to keep contending with the towering influence that Boris Johnson has. And there's no doubt about that. This is a bold man, is a representative of the boldness that Britain represents, including the British Bulldog. He's able to go out there to say what other leaders may be a little bit diplomatic to say. It is good for United Kingdom. It is what United Kingdom represents. Rishi Sunak is busy at home dealing with labor crisis and also stabilizing the economy. This is the best of Boris Johnson that you are seeing. Together with Ben Wallace, they speak what they think the rest of the world should be talking. And they remain a spine in the defense of Ukraine to the war that is raging. It's a win for the international community that a man like that, even though not in office, is able to speak for the rest of the world. It's a win for Boris Johnson himself, because on the international space, he's respected, he will continue to be respected. It's a big bruise against Vladimir Putin, who has no prime minister to attack. This is not Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak has not made any comments about this visit. Boris Johnson has done that as his own person, and it's a good thing to see. However, it's a clear indication of what is to come in the next few days.
In reaction to the Russian reaction to the deployment of the tanks, should it happen in Ukraine, do you think it will be good to call their bluff? The retaliatory measures they are threatening is catastrophic. We know that the use of nuclear weapons will be over the top, and that will mean an end to civilization as we know it if it's employed in that manner. Remember Nagasaki, remember Hiroshima. But how serious do you think you should take Russia's comments?
Well, Russia's comments cannot be treated with kid gloves. We are in a state of war. We've always been. We just use the word invasion, okay? Now, we've said it time and again, and we must not take it off the table. Russia keeps issuing this last threat, but this threat is coming only on the orders of Putin himself. What if Putin is no longer the president in Russia? What if he's no longer the leader? What then happens? Okay, would nuclear weapons be deployed by Russia? Absolutely no, it's not going to happen. China is not even ready. China is busy, its population is now shrinking. Okay, compared to what has happened in recent times. So China itself is dealing with its own economic issues. And Russia needs allies, but there are only few standing by it at this time. Russia, a mainstay there. Russia thinking, would we invade Vietnam? China thinking, would we invade Vietnam? It has its own issues. Would those weapons be deployed? Definitely not, because even Russia cannot risk a war. Is it a reordering of the world order, of world powers? Yes, it is. Is it short term? No, it is not. It's going to go on for at least the next 3-4 years, where power is shifting across different regions of the world. Economic issues will take a place in there. Military might will take a place in there. the world and the Western powers are undergoing different phases of recession. So would he deploy nuclear weapons? No. Does he have the capacity to do that? Definitely yes. Would the rest of the world be waiting for Russia to deploy nuclear weapons? Absolutely not. Something has to give, and in a few weeks it will.
Let's look at solutions now. Mediation. Let's look at how easy it'll be or how hard it'll be in that case for other nations to continue to step in to see whether they can temper the frayed nerves on both sides. What countries do you think hold a sort of trump card that can help to bring this war to the path to closure?
Excellent question that you have asked, something that we should think about. First off, the countries that have the capacity to bring all the parties to the table have their own local issues. United Kingdom would have had that strength to be able to call everybody to order, but UK has never seen an economic crisis like this with labor strikes going on. So UK cannot do more than just keep supplying weapons in terms of military might. United States is going into elections in about a year. And so United States is just on the path of stabilizing its own economy ahead of those elections. It's going to be a major, the next US elections going to be a major ask of the United States. Trump will contest. Biden, maybe. We don't know, okay? So United States too would have a rethink. Germany used to be a strong member of the EU. And when I say strong, I'm talking about the economic powers of Germany, but it's also going through its own issues right now. The EU by itself will play a major role. I think then it comes down to the EU countries. But if it is the EU who has the capability to do this amongst the EU countries, it's not Germany, it's definitely going to be France. France is going to play a major role here with respect to trying to mediate. Poland, not only because it occupies the same region as these warring parties, but because it has some military might. China, we must look at China. If China is prevailed upon to say, talk to Vladimir Putin and let him stand down, then it will happen. But then China will be risking its own position within the international community. China would never see eye to eye with the United States. So it may be down to immediately after the US elections. We may not be able to sit down at the table until after the US elections, and then the next president comes in. I think that the rest of the world has an idea of who that president might be, and then we can bring everybody to the table, have a reordering. There's no doubt that the reorder will happen. Ukraine, regardless of what is going through right now, will be the better for it eventually. So yes, you are looking at France, you are looking at US to play a role, you are looking at Poland, and you are looking at China to play a distinct role.
What about Israel, real quick?
Oh, amazing. So Israel is holding its cards to its chest. Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to come out to say, I support one against the other. It may happen in Israel playing behind the scenes, but definitely not being led by Israel.
Thank you so much for your thoughts on this issue. Mr. Yinka Oyeniji, International Affairs Analyst, speaking to us from East Midlands in the UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you for grilling me too. A great way to start a week.
After the break, Ukraine holds memorial service to honor Interior Minister and other top officials killed in deadly helicopter crash. We'll have details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The White House says the United States will impose additional sanctions next week against Russian private military company, the Wagner Group, which U.S. officials say has been helping Russia's military in the Ukraine war. White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby says the U.S. Treasury Department will designate Wagner as a significant transnational criminal organization, adding that Wagner's growing clout in Russia was causing tension amongst the country's military leadership. Last month, the White House says the Wagner Group had taken delivery of an arms shipment from North Korea to help bolster Russian forces in Ukraine, and a sign of the group's expanding role in that conflict. North Korea's foreign ministry had called the report groundless and denounced the United States for providing lethal weapons to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Wagner owner last month denied taking delivery of arms from North Korea and characterized the report as gossip and speculation.
We've heard repeated concerns that Wagner and groups that are linked to it manufacture or exploit insecurity. They threaten stability. They undermine good governance. They rob countries of mineral wealth. They violate human rights. And we've heard that and seen that again and again. If you go back to 2017, Wagner forces have deployed to the Central African Republic. They've deployed to Mozambique, to Mali, to Libya. And at the same time, we've seen disinformation campaigns that are furthering the exploitative goals that Wagner and its founder have quite literally across the continent of Africa.
Iran's currency has reached an all-time record low, and increasing tension with the West and the unrest gripping the country. Over the weekend, the United States dollar went past the 450,000 rial mark for the first time on the open market. Former Central Bank of Iran Governor Ali Salih Habadi had been sacked after a previous rapid depreciation of the rial in late December that saw it slump to more than 440,000 against the greenback at the open market. His replacement, Mohammad Reza Fazin, had vowed to artificially keep the rate of the currency at 285,000 rials against the dollar for imports of essential goods in an effort to keep prices stable during a 40% inflation rate. As the rial went into another free fall on Saturday, the central bank claimed that 300 million euros of Iran's money in Iraq had been received, despite U.S. sanctions, and injected into the market. Now, Ini John Mekwa joins us to give us further clarity on this situation and others. Let's welcome, good to see you, Ini. Europe may have a schedule to wean itself off Russian fossil fuel, but can Europe find an alternative to the rail route?
Yeah, that's a big question that the region is facing at this time, because of course we do know by now that oil and gas, they have a schedule at the end of this month. They're going to stop depending, at least to a large extent, which they seem to be succeeding at this time to an extent. But what we've not been talking about has been the rail routes. So China is a major supplier of some metals that they use to manufacture electronics, microchips, even the weapons that we're talking about. A lot of it, like 90% of some of those elements, come from China. And it is being transported through Russia, goes on train, on rail, through Russia down to Germany, to be precise. So now, if they are no longer friends, if, because of the war and trying to sanction, and of course we know that money is involved, in all of this supply. So it's not for free transportation or logistics. It costs a lot of money. So if Europe is winning itself off a relationship with Russia, how are they going to handle it? Because the thing that has happened is it takes about, I think they said 6 hours or 16 hours to go from China to Germany to supply this element. Now, if they were to do the water route, it would take about double that. And then there are some other routes which have not been developed, because there's infrastructure need, to be able to move things like that. So
in other words, everything Russia, not just the fossil fuel, even the railways are being affected.
Are being affected. And at this time, I don't think they have seen any alternative to that. So what it tells us is that Europe might still be forced to keep that relationship that they don't. And one way or the other, still providing revenue, to Russia, which they're trying to starve Russia off, because, of course, they don't want Russia to have money to continue with the war. But if they continue using the Russian rail routes for this very, very important, because you're talking of electronics, you're talking of manufacturing of a whole lot of things, and the elements and the metals come from China, then they might indirectly still be feeding Russia.
Wow, so your friend of your enemy is your enemy.
Yeah.
India is denying Russian cargo authorization to offload goods.
Yes. So this is hitting the news, because we know that India they've been buying cheap oil from Russia since the beginning of the war, even when price cap was placed at 60, they were buying Russian oil for as low as $35, you know, and they've really been feeding on this. So it was just last week, there were supposed to be some materials. I was heading for Indonesia, but had to go through India. It's a Russian products, you know, goods for making of nuclear plants that are supposed to be going to Bangladesh, but it has to go through India. And India, which has been friends with Russia, have now denied the ship. So the ship has to return to Russia. So Bangladesh is feeling it because they are the ones who are supposed to use it for their nuclear plant. It's supposed to be there first. But it brings to question, why is India suddenly turning its back against Russia? You know, because they've been friends, they've been getting the cheap oil, and can they survive it? Because India has always been talking about their population, which is very large, and so they need to get as much resources from anybody as possible. Yes. Which is why it seemed like the West kind of turned a blind eye to them still going against the sanctions and buying the cheap oil. So if they start this enmity between themselves, that's India and Russia, can they stand it? And why now? We do know that an official of the United States government was in India, I think last week or so. That is it, as a follow-up of that. Maybe the United States have told them, now we are really serious, we're going to come at you, you know, if you don't follow the rules. But can they really survive it? Can they do without that cheap oil that they've been getting from Russia? I think this is a big question. That
it's a gray area, so we don't really know if it's a one-off occurrence or it's a policy shift.
Exactly, because they have not been doing this way before, and this is just the first time that they are turning their backs against Russia.
Cold War rivals Russia and Pakistan are negotiating an agreement for the Russians to start selling cheap oil to energy-starved Pakistan by March. So is this get out of jail card for Russia to get some money?
Yeah, well, China and India have been the ones buying mostly, although we also had Afghanistan, you know, join that. Now we're seeing Pakistan. Now the interesting thing is, before now, Russia and Pakistan did not have a relationship. It's a history following the Cold War, the war and all of that. They don't have a relationship, you know. But I guess because of need, because Pakistan, the economy is really not doing well. Their reserves have dropped, you know, really, really dropped. And so they do need a kind of buffering. And because their reserves have dropped, they don't have a lot of dollars, you know, to do imports the normal way. So this arrangement is supposed to help them use the yuan, the Chinese yuan, and Russia did start trading the yuan, I think, 2 weeks ago. So this is supposed to help them release the pressure on their reserve, so they don't have to go to their reserve for the dollar that they used to buffer their economy. They could actually use the yuan, and they should be able to get cheap oil from Russia. So it's a good one for Russia because they have a new market, while, you know, Europe and all of that.
Is this sustainable?
Well, I guess that's the big question. I mean, analysts do not see anything stopping it now because Pakistan is really in need of it. And of course, Russia is losing customers for its oil. So, I mean, it looks like a win-win on the surface for them. And Pakistan and China have been friends. They've been friends for a long time. And they're the ones helping to facilitate it, since they'll be using the Chinese currency anyway and not the dollar. So it looks like a win-win for them. But we'll see, you know, the thing with international politics, you don't know the sentiments that crop up, you know, from unexpected quarters. But for now, it looks like it's going to be a win-win for them.
So the enemy of your enemy is now my friend.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So what about the currency market as far as the Russian ruble is doing? Is anything new?
Well, nothing really new because we see the ruble is being buffered with a lot of moves or strategies by the central bank. So even when it does taper, drops a bit, we see it regain again because of moves like this, because we see their demand for the ruble. So once there's demand on the ruble, then, I mean, it's not looking like a currency that has been battered with a lot of sanctions. That is, I mean, that is it, you know. And Russia, especially and the CBN, they're really working. We did see that even their inflation is not as high, consumer inflation, as high as one would have expected with all of the companies and corporates that have left the country. So the economy doesn't look as bad as the sanctions would want it to look, but we are not carried away because we do know that it's a lot of buffering efforts by the government. We talked about how the government has given like subsidy to small and medium enterprises to help them stay up, to help them keep employment. You know, some of those things are artificial, kind of, and they feed into the ruble and help it to stay strong. But that's not the ideal. You know, you're supposed to allow, of course, economic factors to work together and hold the currency, give value to the currency. But right now, what we see in Russia is a lot of help from the government, you know, and they're finding ways to keep it there. So the numbers we see do look not so bad, but when you look underneath and see the strategy and the efforts of the government to keep those the ruble and those numbers, the microeconomy, the inflation, you know, to keep it that way, then you know that it's heavily assisted. And if they can sustain it well.
That's not good news for Ukraine.
No, not good news for Ukraine at all. Because if you look the other way and look at Ukraine, Ukraine is really battered.
That's why we have to bring this, or the war has to be brought to an end.
Yes, I don't know what else we're going to do. We've had a lot of intervention and talks. You know, now we're not even talking about Ukraine and Russia coming to the table anymore. We had that hope some months ago because the war is going to be a year in a couple of weeks.
It's amazing how time flies.
Yes, and the number of lives that have been lost and property, you know, that have been destroyed.
Very tragic, very tragic.
Very, very.
Thank you so much, Ini. Our business correspondent, Channels Television's Ini John Mekwa.
It's
going to be a business morning at the top of the next hour, right?
Yes, nice, yes.
So for more from Ini and our business desk, please stay with Channels Television for that. You're watching our special coverage of the Russian war or invasion of Ukraine. When we return, the Chinese New Year celebration in Moscow. Plus, we have a special interview with Mr. David Awurawo, Professor and Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Please join us again. Welcome back. A Ukrainian Deputy Minister, Vasyl Lazynsky, has been arrested on suspicion of embezzling funds intended for rebuilding the country's damaged infrastructure. An investigation by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine found that public funds put aside for alternative energy sources during the winter months had been misappropriated. Ukraine's infrastructure ministry confirmed the arrest of Vasyl Lazynsky on his Facebook page, writing, "Today it became known that Vasyl Lazynsky, acting Minister of Communities and Territories Development of Ukraine, was detained for embezzlement of budget funds." It said that Lazynsky, who has not commented on the allegations, will be dismissed from his position. According to the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Lazynsky is accused of receiving $400,000 in unlawful benefits. National Anti-Corruption Bureau said it had exposed and stopped the embezzlement of budget funds, and detectives detained him, that is Lazynsky, for receiving $400,000 in unlawful benefits. It adds that the deputy minister received the money for facilitating the signing of contracts for the purchase of overpriced equipment and machinery. Now, joining us is Professor David Awurawo, Professor and Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos, joining us virtually from Makoka in Lagos, Southwest Nigeria. You're welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.
So it appears that Ukrainians or Ukraine is not immune to corruption or some corrupt individuals. It's mind-boggling to find that this highly placed Ukrainian official will go as far as to be, if it's proven to be true, as to embezzle funds meant for the solace, the comfort of the people of Ukraine.
Yeah, it is a bit surprising, even though it is not unusual. You always have bad guys everywhere, individuals who want to take advantage of even the misery of their fellow citizens and their country. So it is not unusual, but it is surprising considering the condition in which Ukraine finds itself at this time. What we see on the surface is that everybody is committed to the struggle, committed to winning the war, committed to bringing the war to an end, so that Ukraine can move on with its life. So yeah, it is surprising, given what we see generally on the surface, how people have abandoned important economic activities in other countries and returned to Ukraine to fight. And now to see somebody in charge of, contracts and ensuring that the war is won, to do a thing like this, it is surprising.
Okay, then, let's turn our attention to the visit of Boris Johnson to Ukraine. We know that the UK have shown unfettered support for Ukraine's war efforts to defend itself from Russian aggression. But do you think that this adds any teeth to the support of the UK, of England, for Russia, or it doesn't mean much? For Ukraine, beg your pardon, or it doesn't mean much?
Yeah, it has its own impact. In a war like this, there is the psychological dimension. There is the moral dimension. What the visit of Boris Johnson will achieve is to help boost morale and to uplift Ukrainians psychologically. You recall that when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the UK gave massive support to Ukraine. Perhaps the UK will come just behind the United States in the countries that gave extensive support to Ukraine early on in the war, before others began to join and also, lend their support now. So the Ukrainians have always appreciated Boris Johnson. When he left, they regretted that Boris Johnson was leaving, and they said they hoped that the successor would do like Boris Johnson had done. So the visit is significant because it helps to boost morale. It also helps to, expand the psychological commitment, and of course, make Ukrainians to have the feeling that the world is behind them in this war.
So it doesn't matter that Boris Johnson's exit as Prime Minister did not go out with a bang as much as his entry as Prime Minister, because he had to leave that office for certain reasons. Do you not think, or did it diminish his influence in any way at all?
Yes, it does. It does diminish. I mean, somebody who is out of office will not be on the same pedestal as someone who is Prime Minister, someone who is able to, make decisions and take actions that will impact directly on the course of the war. So it has a significant, difference. That is the fact that Boris Johnson is no longer the Prime Minister. Like I said before, Ukrainians will have wished that Boris Johnson will continue, but of course they don't have influence and control over internal politics of the United Kingdom. So if Boris Johnson were visiting as Prime Minister, of course, the impact would be very, very huge. The impact is diminished by the fact that he's going as an ordinary citizen, which was why I limited my comment to just psychological and moral boosting impact that the visit will have, unlike the material impact and other aspects of positive development that Boris Johnson's visit would have had if he were still the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So he is going as a private citizen diminishes, the influence of his visit compared with if he were still the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Earlier in the program, Professor, we covered the reactions and of the comments of the French President Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz concerning the deployment of tanks for the aid of Ukrainian efforts. Historically speaking, given the antecedents of Russia, and they have replied and said that if that does happen, they'll consider it as offensive weapons and they'll retaliate with greater weaponry. Do you think that they will back down and not do so? Or do you think it'll just escalate the war?
Well, where we are now, I do not think that any support that these countries give will have a similar impact on what Russia does. The only thing Russia cannot use now, or will not likely use now, is nuclear weapon. Russia has used everything it has to prosecute this war. So supplying those tanks to Ukraine will not in any way affect how Russia will respond, or whether Russia will respond with greater intensity, in prosecuting the war. Russia has already, used virtually everything it has, to prosecute the war. So it will be in the interest of Ukraine and the coalition for France and Germany to supply everything they can. It is true that they are trying to walk a thin line because they have their military defense policy and all that. So they are trying to walk a fine line between their defense policy and how much support they can give to Ukraine at this time. But regarding whether it will escalate the war cannot be escalated more than it has. Russia has used virtually everything it has. It has also broken, international law in diverse ways in prosecuting the war. So the argument that, if Germany and France supply some weapons, Russia will be more nasty in its approach to the war, cannot fly. Russia has used everything. The only thing Russia has left that it has not used is the nuclear weapon. So
Professor,
let's see how it goes. We hope that more support will be given to Ukraine.
I wish we had enough time, Professor. When you said, sorry to interrupt you, and we have to close here, but when you said that Russia has used everything it has it actually deployed an air offensive? It hasn't actually done that, has it? And maybe just 1 second. I'm talking about its Air Force. It hasn't really done that because of the consequences will be dire.
Yes, in fact, Russia is those things that would cause global conflagration. Those are the only things that, Russia has avoided. Everything else, Russia has used in prosecuting the war.
Professor, for your time, for coming on the program this morning, we really appreciate it. Professor David Aworawo, Professor and Head of Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos.
Thanks so very much for having me on the program.
Finally, a tearful Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky attended a memorial service to commemorate 7 senior Interior Ministry officials killed in a helicopter crash last week, a fresh blow to a nation already grieving its many war dead. The Interior Minister, his deputy, and 5 other high-ranking ministry officials were killed when the helicopter plummeted amidst fog into a nursery on the eastern outskirts of Kyiv on Wednesday. Officials are still investigating the cause of the crash. Zelensky wrote in a Telegram post, "The indescribable sadness is covering the soul. Ukraine is losing its best sons and daughters every day." Zelensky and his wife, Olena Zelensky, paid their respects to the victims' relatives inside the Hawking Ukrainian House of Cultural Center in central Kyiv. A crowd of mourners snaked outside toward Independence Square. Finally on the program, hundreds of Russians visited Chinese Lunar New Year celebration in the Russian capital, Moscow. The event was staged at a famous exhibition of economic achievement exhibition center known for Soviet-style surroundings. Despite the fact that the Chinese population in Moscow is relatively small, the interest in China and Chinese culture is on the rise in Russia. Last week, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the relations between the two countries were as good as ever. The interest in China comes at a time when the relations between Russia and the West hit the lowest point over what Russia calls a special military operation in Ukraine. The festival's many customs, observed by millions of Chinese communities around the globe, all link back to the idea of inviting good fortune and prosperity and chasing away bad luck. That's today's edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. You have a good day.